Welcome to our History channel. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and share this episode with a fellow history lover. And now, on to tonight's episode. Pennsylvania, May 28, 1754. Lieutenant Colonel George Washington's blue-gray eyes squint through the near-total darkness of a starless night, down upon an encampment of 36 French-Canadian soldiers in the Glen below, 60 miles south of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Flanked by 40 Virginian troops and a dozen Iroquois warriors, the 21-year-old Washington stands at the precipice of vicious bloodshed. Pressure has been building to this catalytic event between the French and British empires for years, as their imperialist desires for North America come to a head. The French, under the rule of King Louis XV, have been expanding ever southward from northeastern Canada, where New France holds substantial territory. From the eastern half of Canada, throughout the Great Lakes region, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico by way of the Mississippi River. Disputes over these resource-rich lands are nothing new for the French Empire. The Beaver Wars of the 17th century saw clashes over the territory occurring for nearly a century, and its conclusive treaty, the Great Peace of Montreal, that brought 39 indigenous nations together to make peace with New France in 1701, provided but 16 years of ceasefire before violence broke out again. The expansionist desires of New France faced a looming threat in what would become a multi-dimensional conflict for the highly sought-after Ohio country, a region which was comprised of present-day Ohio, Indiana, as well as parts of western Pennsylvania and West Virginia. This territory was collected under the British royal grant to the Ohio Company, entrusted to encourage settlement, as well as offer protection from French aggression and advancement into the region. Among the champions of British colonial expansion was Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie, a native of Glasgow, Scotland. While governors of British colonies remained in Europe, Dinwiddie served as de facto royal governor of Virginia. His interest in the Ohio Company was not purely political, as he was a major stockholder in the Ohio Company. The Ohio Company had conducted surveys and established a few small settlements in the Ohio Territory. In 1753, upon learning of the construction of multiple French fortifications near Lake Erie, Governor Dinwiddie was sent an 8-man party to formally request the French withdrawal from the territory. Dinwiddie selected a young major from the Virginia militia to lead this expedition, a 21-year-old George Washington. The Virginia governor was not the only leader in the area who took opposition to the French territorial expansion. The Mingo chief, Tanacharison, also known as the Half-King, also took umbrage with the new fortifications being built in this region. The Half-King had met the commander of the French-Canadian construction efforts, Paul Marin de la Malgue, and Tanacharison had bestowed wampum to the commander in a goodwill gesture before delivering his message of concern for the French advancement. Advancements. Marin de la Malgue took a direct and incendiary approach in his response, slamming down the wampum to the floor and charging back. "I'll tell you over the river, I will go. If the river is blocked, I have the forces to burst it open and tread under my feet all that oppose me. I despise all the stupid things that you have said." Understandably, this insulted the Half-King, as he had already felt a particular disdain for the way his people had been treated by the French, treating the natives more as offspring than equals. In December of 1753, Major Washington's envoy would head northwest to the Ohio Territory. The directive Washington was given, handed down to Dinwiddie directly from London, is as follows. If the French were to be found building forts on English soil, they should be peacefully asked to depart. If they have failed to comply, however, we do hereby strictly charge and command you to drive them off by force of arms. The order was signed directly by King George II. Washington's selection for this mission, at such a young age, was in part because of his experience as a land surveyor giving him an understanding of the terrain of which he was about to traverse. Upon their arrival at Logstown, Major Washington requested a conference with Seneca tribal leader Tanasharison. Washington handed the half-king's associate a string of wampum and some tobacco to his deputy upon delivering the request. On November 25th, the half-king arrived to meet Washington and made a point to intimate to the young major many horrid tales of the French, that they had killed, cooked, and then cannibalized his father, that they viewed he and his people as more mosquitoes and flies than humans. The native leader said he viewed the British as trading peers, while their French counterparts were coming to conquer and displace them. The half-king adorned George Washington with the nickname Cana Tercarius, that was likewise bestowed upon George Washington's great-grandfather, John Washington. The name means town-taker and destroyer of villages, and while the literal translation may seem a slight of him, George Washington contentedly accepted the moniker, and would even write about it fondly later in life, noting that it was not given to him from Tanasharison as a pejorative. Washington's request for the half-king to provide an escort to the French fort to deliver his diplomatic message was granted after a few days' delay for the natives to ceremonially bestow wampum to their new young ally. The escort offered was comprised of only 4 men, including the half-king, and the journey consisted of 5 days of trudging through near-freezing rains, through bitter winds, and thick mud from the ground that had not yet solidified under a proper winter's freeze. Washington arrived at the trading post of the Nongo and was greeted by the French captain Philippe Thomas Chabert de Jonquet. Born to a French officer and a Seneca woman, he served as a translator in French and Indian affairs. The wine flowed freely that night, and while Washington kept his wits about him, he listened keenly as the French began to disclose their ambitious design to take possession of the Ohio and reveal the location of their forts amidst their drunken negligence. After a few days' delay at Venango, the young Major Washington's party, now accompanied by both a native as well as a French escort, headed off for Fort Le Boeuf. The 40-mile journey consisted of some of the most difficult conditions he had faced, with many mires and swamps needing to be covered. With the temperature plummeting below freezing, Washington rode on ahead of his party with Christopher Gist. Gist was a frontiersman from North Carolina, cut from the same cloth as Daniel Boone, a man who Gist would call his neighbor while living on the Pennsylvania frontier. Gist had been hired by the Ohio Company for £150 sterling, a meager salary Washington would have been willing to pay him innumerable times over had he had the requisite funds himself. The arduous journey to Fort Le Boeuf would come to a close on the night of December 11th, as Washington and Gist would arrive at the makeshift compound, consisting of 4 buildings put together with haste, using bark and plank. Captain Jacques Lagardeur de Saint-Pierre, a gray-haired, one-eyed commander, who remained hospitable even after learning of Washington's message calling for the withdrawal of the French Canadians from the Ohio Valley. Saint-Pierre informed Washington he did not feel obliged to obey the directive he had been delivered, and stated that the French had every right to kill and capture British traders within the Ohio country. Colonial Britain's concerns about French expansion had now been proven accurate, and Washington took great care while at the fort to compile extensive notes on the hundreds of canoes and extensive armaments the French had stockpiled. Before heading back, Washington would come to find that St. Pierre had offered liquor, guns, and provisions to the half-king and his men in an attempt to get them to stay at Fort Le Boeuf and forego returning as guides with Washington. Upon learning of this plot, an irate Washington confronted the half-king and accused him of betraying his agreement and confidence. The Seneca leader then refused Washington's request to lead him back to their home base. While Washington had a zealous ambition to return to Williamsburg with news of the belligerent actions of the French and their non-compliant response to his delivered message, the journey home would put the young major's life in precarious circumstances on multiple occasions. The horses that they had brought along on the journey were in such poor condition, it was decided better to abandon them. Washington and Geist, with a couple of natives as their guides, headed forth on their own as they endeavored to promptly bring the response to Governor Dinwiddie. As Geist and Washington navigated their canoe through icy waters, nearly being upended on multiple occasions, and plunged into the frigid current, they arrived at their first rest stop, and when their Indian guides would not continue on with them, they made the trek on their own. Along the way, they met a party of French Indians who agreed to be their guides, taking them the shortest way to the Ohio River. Washington was suffering from exhaustion so severe he let one of his guides carry his backpack along the route. After trekking a substantial distance, the French Indian guides suddenly raced out ahead of them and turned around just 10 yards away to fire directly at Washington and Geist. Christopher Geist rushed forward and took the native to the ground, preparing to slay their would-be killer when Washington cried out for him to stop. Washington spared the hostile guide's life, instead opting to bind him until dusk and then release him into the woods. Washington and Geist traveled until dawn in the opposite direction, all the while fearing a reprisal attack. They would spend an entire day crafting a makeshift raft to cross the Allegheny River. Once they launched the watercraft, they became aware of how swift and violent the current truly was, and the canoe struck a chunk of ice racing downstream. Washington was thrown into the freezing waters. He fought his way to the surface and latched onto a chunk of wood from the canoe that was floating past him. Geist would manage to stay on board the craft, steering it towards a small island. From here he would fish the soaking Washington out of the river, and the two would promptly find themselves trapped there until daybreak would afford them enough visibility to continue on. They would shiver the whole night through. Washington's remarkable constitution was on display as he would survive relatively unscathed. Geist would be the one to suffer frostbite, the icy plague present on his fingers and his toes, even though Washington had been the one to plunge into the wintry stream. At dawn, they were relieved to see the river had frozen over during the night, and they crossed the remainder of it with relative ease. On January 16, 1754, Washington arrived in Williamsburg to hand-deliver the sealed letter from the French commandant to Royal Governor Dinwiddie. At this meeting, Washington would outline much of the details he had observed and recorded in his journals about the French fortifications and capabilities. Dinwiddie asked Washington to compile his notes into a concise report, which he could deliver to the council the next day. Washington spent the night arranging the report, and its impact would be far greater than the young major could have ever expected. The report was published across colonies as far north as Massachusetts, and it would be printed as a pamphlet in London as the Journal of Major George Washington, thrusting his name into the spotlight for the first time. For this expedition, Washington was paid £50, a figure he had found unfavorable, but he managed to parlay the event into a promotion to the rank of lieutenant colonel just around the time of his 22nd birthday. Dinwiddie ordered the construction of a fort on the forks of the Ohio. The location had been suggested to him by Washington, and he brought on William Trent of the Ohio Company as captain, with instructions to commence building the fort at once. Washington was ordered to cobble together what forces he could and to march them to the forks of the Ohio that spring to secure the area for the fort's construction. That February also saw 800 French-Canadian militia troops depart from Montreal, heading for the Ohio Valley. Washington's forces were paltry in comparison, a truly ragtag bunch, numbering just 160 at the time of departure. The Virginian wrote of his men that they were, quote, loose, idle persons that were quite destitute of house and home, and quite many of them of clothes. Washington sought red uniforms for his men, of the kind worn by His Majesty's troops, as he felt as though the colonial regiments were looked upon as second-class citizens. a feeling that would linger throughout his British colonial military career. When word came down to Dinwiddie of a French raiding party, charting a path towards the forks of the Ohio, Washington was ordered to take what troops he had and head out at once. He was instructed to maintain a defensive posture, but was authorized to use deadly force with the French to obstruct any of their settlements or fortifications. On April 2nd, Washington headed out with his green recruits. 3 weeks of traveling had passed when Washington received unsettling intelligence about French activity in the Ohio country. Over 1,000 French troops had overtaken British forces at the forks of the Ohio River, and the fort had fallen into French hands, being renamed Fort Duquesne. On the night of May 24th, Washington received word from his scouts that a French platoon had crossed the river and was staying just 18 miles away. Washington took up a defensive position at the Great Meadows, near present-day Uniontown, Pennsylvania. Christopher Gist reported to Washington that French soldiers had invaded his cabin and threatened to kill his livestock and pillage his home. The Half-King, having joined forces with Washington once more, confirmed the existence of this rogue band of French Canadians and informed him that they had set up camp just 7 miles from their location. Upon hearing this, Washington altered course from his defensive mindset, not wanting to toil through yet another night of waiting to be stumbled upon, or worse yet, ambushed. Washington and the Half-King set out with their 40 men, a dozen of which were natives, and voyaged out into a rainy, moonless night, hunting for the French encampment. The night was so dark that the men continuously stumbled into one another as they marched single file. 7 soldiers went astray into the woods, losing step with those in front of them and unwilling to decry them as steps, as a break in the silence would give away their position to enemies who may be nearby. In the pre-dawn hours of May 28, under the navigation of the Half-King, Washington now leads the men to the crest of a hollow surrounded by rocks. From the high ground above the sleeping French encampment, the natives slip through the trees to encircle them and block any escape from Washington and his men. Upon hearing the rustling around them, the French grasp for their arms, and shots ring out towards the colonials. Washington's men fire off 2 quick volleys that leave at least 10 French soldiers lying dead, while the rest throw their arms down and surrender. Now, as they descend upon the forfeiting side to capture the remaining men, this course of events takes a dark and unsettling turn. From the woods behind the encampment, the Half-King walks towards the wounded French officer, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, and speaks in French. "Thou art not yet dead, my father." The Half-King then raises his hatchet above his head, and with tremendous force strikes it down upon the skull of Jumonville. He repeats this 3 more times as a stunned Washington looks on silently. The Half-King now reaches his hand into the cracked skull of Jumonville, removing a portion of his brain matter, then ritualistically kneads it through his fingers, as though he were washing his hands with. Washington, having suffered 1 man killed and 3 others wounded, finds himself in a precarious circumstance. He knows that admonishing the Half-King could create an unwanted divide between them, and he seeks the most diplomatic way to make his position a sympathetic one. In his reporting of the events to Governor Dinwiddie, Washington emphasizes the French's aggression in the prelude to the firefight, as well as the clandestine way they had spied on their party's activities, whereas Washington had delivered his diplomatic message the prior December with a statesmanlike dignity. The French account is markedly different from that of the British, and will even be used to propagandize Washington as a murderer and inflame the diplomatic relations of the 2 empires in precursor to war. Washington, however, does not have time to ruminate on the empirical effects of his actions, as he knows a French counterattack will be on its way. The Virginian commands his men to dig a circular fortification for the coming onslaught. This fort will come to be known as Fort Necessity, and the battle that follows will see the young lieutenant colonel captured by his new-found enemy. But the tales of heroism and sacrifice in the coming years and decades are too numerous to cover in one episode. For tonight, those are other stories for other times. Thank you for joining us on this episode of History at the Ogika Rock. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes, as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking the Join button, or click the link in the description below to become a member on Patreon. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the Ogika Rao, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.